Dr. Marston just highlighted the importance of the patient voice and that patients are the experts in their condition, that they have the lived experience. And it's so important. And during this panel, we're going to hear from 3 different patient-driven research initiatives. And so I'd like to invite Lisa McCorkell to come up first. Lisa is a person living with long COVID and the co-founder of the Patient-Led Research Collaborative. She has coordinated a patient-led biomedical research fund of $5 million toward long COVID and associated conditions, and has co-created scorecards that evaluate meaningful patient engagement in research. She has a master's in public policy from the University of California, Berkeley, and a background in social safety net policy and labor and employment issues. So Lisa, thank you so much.
Good morning, everyone. I'm gonna grab this. Kneeling helps with my POTS symptoms, so that's what I'll be doing. All right, hi everyone, good morning. My name is Lisa McCorkell. Like Liz said, I'm a person living with long COVID since March of 2020 and one of the co-founders of the Patient-Led Research Collaborative. I really appreciate being here today. I've been personally fighting for the inclusion of infection-associated chronic condition research in long COVID research for the last 3 years. So this workshop is incredible. And I'm also the daughter of someone with MS, so just really full circle, it feels like. Today I'll be taking a little bit of a break from deep scientific talk and speaking with you about who Patient-Led Research Collaborative is, some of our findings, the work we've accomplished, the importance of meaningful patient engagement, and what a patient-driven research agenda might look like. Perfect. So who is Patient-Led Research Collaborative, or PLRC? In her talk yesterday, my fellow co-founder Hannah Davis gave a brief introduction to who we are. We are a group of people with long COVID and associated conditions that formed out of the Body Politic COVID-19 support group on Slack in April of 2020. We are now at over 45 members that span 4 continents. We have multidisciplinary backgrounds that really help us bring unique lenses to long COVID. My own background is in public policy. And I'll take you back to those early days when we formed. So all of the co-founders got sick within a couple weeks of each other in March of 2020. We all had fairly mild infections, or acute infections, but we never recovered. About a month into our symptoms, many of us were worse off than we were in that acute stage. I personally couldn't walk upstairs without having extreme tachycardia and shortness of breath. Now, disabled people and people who had other infection-associated chronic conditions like ME/CFS were trying to get the word out at this time that this was an option of the pandemic, that a COVID infection could lead to these long-term symptoms. But unfortunately, without the media or the government amplifying this message, I personally didn't know this was an option, and many of us who were joining the support group were flabbergasted as to what was happening to us. But then Fiona Lowenstein wrote an op-ed in the New York Times describing their own experience with not recovering and started this body politics support group. I joined immediately, and people started sharing their symptoms, their experiences with healthcare providers, and a lot more. And a group of us who joined the support group who had a variety of research backgrounds decided we need to try to collect all these experiences, try to identify trends and symptoms, and so we decided to put out a survey. What this resulted in was the first research on long COVID. This is the paper. We just posted it as a Google Doc. It remains as such in May of 2020. We identified 62 symptoms that people were experiencing, including neurological, which at the time, COVID was thought of as a purely respiratory illness. This report validated patient experiences and really helped to get long COVID into the media and being discussed in government. Because so many of us, especially in those early days, but even now, were unable to get a COVID test, we compared the prevalence and trajectory of all symptoms between those with a positive test and those who didn't have a positive test, and found no difference between the symptoms except for loss of taste and smell. This should have large implications since so many of us were and continue to be denied care due to lack of positive tests because of its inaccessibility and often lack of accuracy. So it's really important in research studies and clinical trials that a positive test is not required due to how difficult it can be to access and often how inaccurate these tests are. But as time went on, we weren't getting better and more people were developing long COVID. That survey was just a couple months in. We are hearing of more symptoms that people were experiencing. More people were coming to us in the support group. And a lot of people who were developing long COVID had, like us, initially mild infections, but that often wasn't the narrative that was being discussed in the media. So we decided to take things into our own hands again because researchers were slow to pick this up and our healthcare providers were dismissing our symptoms. So we put out another survey. This resulted in a paper that was published in the Lancet's eClinical Medicine in July of 2021. By the time we put out this survey, we had already begun connecting with people with ME/CFS, with POTS, mast cell activation syndrome. And by connecting with these folks, with these communities, we identified so many overlapping symptoms. We were able to ask questions that reflected those insights, things like asking about post-exertional malaise, which is one of the top symptoms now we know of long COVID, asking about pacing, medication sensitivity, new allergies, and even test results for EBV, Lyme, and CMV. Some of the highlights of this paper is that we documented over 200 symptoms that wax and wane over time, with people experiencing the most frequent symptoms after month 6 being fatigue, post-exertional malaise, and cognitive dysfunction. We found that cognitive dysfunction did not vary across age groups. And we found that 2/3 of people with long COVID had to reduce their work schedule or stop working completely due to their illness. Another paper that we worked on, so Hannah Davis and I co-authored this review in Nature Reviews Microbiology with Julia Moore-Vogel and Eric Topol at Scripps. 3 of us are people with long COVID, so this is really a patient-led paper. And this was published in January of this year. And this covers much of the existing evidence on long COVID, focusing on mechanisms as well as the overlap with other conditions, much like what this workshop is doing today. We also have a section on long COVID in children, which unfortunately is too often overlooked. And I want to mention, not as a brag, but more as a call out to how important this work is and how critical a patient lens can be, that this paper has been accessed over 1 million times since January. And out of 23.9 million research outputs ever tracked on Altmetric in terms of how much attention it's received, it's number 77. If that doesn't show the scale of this issue and how much this paper was needed, I don't know what does. We also recently published a paper on the psychiatric outcomes and coping in long COVID. And in this paper, we found that a substantial minority of both people with and without long COVID in our survey experienced suicidality, depression, and anxiety symptoms. And while these symptoms were more common in the long COVID group, they were not experienced by a majority of people with long COVID. Additionally, long COVID respondents used more adaptive coping styles than people without long COVID, reinforcing that long COVID is not in and of itself an illness defined by presence of these psychiatric symptoms, nor maladaptive coping. We also recently published this review on reproductive health impacts of long COVID and associated illnesses, including ME/CFS, POTS, and connective tissue disorders. And while this area of research is vastly understudied, as patients tell us, and I've experienced myself, it really impacts us. And like a lot of people experience these reproductive health impacts. And so we wanted to collate the research to date and use what we hope is now a paradigm shift for how we approach these conditions, really looking at the evidence together, given their commonalities, given their comorbidities. So on the screen is the evidence there is to date on a variety of conditions and impacts to women. Here are highlights of some of our other work to date as an organization. So we currently have a survey out on the impact of reinfections on people with long COVID, since we hear so much anecdotally in the community about this. We are working on a mixed method study on long COVID's impact on employment and quality of life. We just published our first issue of the Patient-Generated Hypotheses Journal, which is a journal of hypotheses that are written by patients and caregivers for biomedical researchers to pursue. I'll describe these more in a second, but in collaboration with CMSS, we developed scorecards that evaluate meaningful patient engagement. We had a $5 million biomedical research fund that we awarded out to 10 grantees that were chosen by a panel of patient researchers, really focusing on funding high-quality research on what's important to the patient population. And added into the award are patients that will serve on the study design teams. And we use the data that's available and patient experience to advocate for better research, guidelines, and policy. So over the last 3 years, we've been busy, we've done a lot, we've learned a lot, and we've seen that not just for our own research, but in research that we and other patients consult on, that when research incorporates the patient perspective, even if it's not led by patients, it so much more encapsulates the patient experience and leads us to better research and better outcomes. And I want to be clear right now that patients leading and being engaged with research is not new since long COVID. There's a vast history, particularly in HIV/AIDS, but also in diabetes, Parkinson's, ALS, ME/CFS, Lyme, of patients doing their own research and really helping to steer research towards answers faster. And there's also a long history of communities most impacted playing a key role in other types of research outside of biomedical research. So while this isn't necessarily taught in medical school for how best to engage patients, it's not too novel of a concept at this point. And there's a reason it's not a novel concept. There's immense value to it. We found that research with patient perspective is often more relevant to patients' lives. It's based on emerging priorities that directly serve patients. It's more effective. These research questions respond to patient community insights, leading to faster results. So as an example, post-exertional malaise was a top symptom in our study, but only because we knew to ask about it. Many providers still aren't familiar with what that symptom is. It doesn't have its own ICD code. So only with patient insight and understanding the condition from patients themselves would researchers even know to ask about it. There are different incentive structures at play that should be acknowledged here. A lot of the work that we did, and partially how we were successful, is because we were driven out of desperation. We weren't trying to make a career out of this, and so we could actually take more risks than a lot of biomedical researchers. That's also why it's really crucial for funders to recognize the value of patient-engaged research so that they can incentivize themselves meaningful engagement and provide funding for it. And then research with patient perspective is primarily impact-driven. The point of this research is to be shared and to result in better outcomes. So our priority is to disseminate widely and accessibly so that it makes a difference. I think many in this room, just by nature of being in this room, are impact-driven, but too often in academia, it does take a long time. I think it's an average of 17 years, I heard, to translate into clinical practice and meaningful patient outcomes. So for patients living with a debilitating disease, that's far too long. So here are the scorecards that I was referring to, which evaluate meaningful patient engagement. These really aim to establish a new baseline of what's acceptable. It's not enough just to have a patient in a room. Their voice needs to matter in that room. Their expertise needs to be valued. Their insights need to be incorporated. So these scorecards really help set that up. So there's 4 scorecards that we have, another one coming. I want to highlight one of them in particular, which is the integration into research process scorecard. And hopefully you can see, it's a little small, but that patient engagement really needs to happen at every stage of the research process. It's not just recruitment, which is often what we're delegated to help with. It is coming up with the hypothesis. It's being involved in the study design. It's in the analysis, publication, and attribution. So if you're able to do this and do it meaningfully, your research is going to result in better outcomes for patients because it's going to be answering questions patients want to know. It will be designed in a way that reflects the patient experience, and it will ensure that the patient voice is heard throughout. So I encourage you to check these out. I'll try to send the slides around, which have a link at the end. And since this workshop is about establishing a common research agenda across infection-associated chronic conditions, I want to touch a little bit about what the bones of a patient-driven research agenda might look like. So one, it would ensure meaningful engagement of patients and caregivers in all stages of the research process. It would have funders incentivize meaningful engagement of patients and caregivers. It would integrate new and existing evidence across infection-associated chronic conditions. This is what's going to be getting us to answers faster. As patients, we know this, we've been pushing for this. We need to be accelerating clinical trials of therapeutics that are a priority to the patient community. In long COVID, this includes antihistamines, anticoagulants, JAK-STAT inhibitors, and immunomodulators. And quality of life and functional endpoints and functional ability need to be endpoints for these trials. That's really what matters for a patient's day-to-day life. And we need better coordination of all of this so that research doesn't exist in silos. A good way to do that is to establish an Office for Infection-Associated Chronic Illnesses in the NIH Director's Office. That is my time. Feel free to contact me or our team. And then here are the references from my talk. Thank you.
Thank you, Lisa. And I wanted to let everyone know that the slides will be posted online, so you can go back and look at those wonderful scorecards, especially the patient involvement in research. And I think that's an excellent point, that patients really need to be involved at every step because they have the lived experience and they know things that researchers don't know because researchers aren't living with the disease.